The suppressant patch peeled off in the alley, and so did the last of my nerve. I pressed a fresh one to the inside of my wrist before the tremor in my hand could ruin the placement, counted to 10 the way the manual said, and listened to the tryout instructors filing out of the warehouse behind me, laughing about the woman who'd shot a perfect course, and then asked, politely, if there was a bathroom she could use alone for exactly 4 minutes. There was. They just didn't know why I needed it. My name is Ren Kessler. I was 28 years old, 6 months behind on rent, and 41 days from the date my sister's transplant fund needed another $11,000 it did not have. I had scored highest on the tactical course that morning, out of 19 applicants, in a warehouse in the Harrow docks that smelled like motor oil and old rain. I had also failed the interview because somewhere between the obstacle run and the paperwork, someone had flagged my file with a single word. Pending. Designation. Pending. Agencies did not hire pending. Agencies hired betas, alphas, men who could be trusted not to bleed a cent into a room at the wrong moment, not omegas who might go soft, or worse, go into heat inside a man's blast radius. That was the official reasoning. I had heard 6 versions of it since I was 24, and I had learned to nod at all of them. I had not always hidden it. 4 years in the Reach Corps as a combat medic had taught me how to read an exit before I read a face, how to stop a bleed with a belt and a prayer, how to put 2 rounds through a target the size of a fist at 90 yards without letting my hands know they were shaking. It had also taught me, on the worst night of that service, what happens to an Omega soldier once a field medic's routine blood panel comes back the wrong color. They did not court-martial me. They just found reasons, quietly, over 11 days, to need me gone. I left with a discharge that said nothing on paper and meant everything in the room. So I stopped waiting for the paperwork, to be honest, and started managing the evidence myself. Patches on the wrist, a blocker gel under the jaw, a scuffed silver pillbox, dented at one corner, engraved on the lid with 2 initials that weren't mine, MK. My mother's, Miriam Kessler, dead 9 years and still the only person who'd never once looked at me like I was a liability waiting to happen. I carried her pillbox because it held my second set of patches, and because some nights it was easier to be brave about lying if I told myself she'd have understood. The alley smelled like fryer grease from the diner 2 doors down, where I picked up the shifts the tryouts didn't pay. I was 3 streets from home, doing math I already knew the answer to. Dialysis was $600 a week. The transplant was $340,000 exactly. My sister Mabel had 4 months left on the donor list before her numbers dropped too far to qualify, when my phone lit up with a name I hadn't heard in 2 years. Priya Ansari didn't say hello. She said, "Are you still pretending to be a beta for money?" And I said yes, and she said, "Good, I've got a contract that doesn't check registries." Bad news is the last person who held it died Tuesday. I asked whose detail it was. She told me, and even in an alley that smelled like old grease, I felt the temperature of the whole city drop. The quiet queen of Harrow Docks did not hire from open tryouts. She did not, as a rule, hire anyone who'd failed 3 hours earlier for a designation she was supposed to have on file. But her last bodyguard had taken 2 rounds to the chest outside a shipping office at 11:52 p.m. 2 nights before, and grief, I was learning, made even careful women desperate enough to skip the paperwork. I went home, packed 1 bag, and did not sleep. The interview, it turned out, was not an interview. It was a floor of the Vane shipping office at 7 the next morning. 11 candidates in a line, and 40 seconds into the meeting, a black van took out the front gate, and 6 men came through the loading door with rifles low and eyes that had clearly done this before. I put the first one down with a fire extinguisher before I'd finished deciding to move. The second went for the woman standing at the head of the room, tall, unmoving, dressed like she'd been expecting a board meeting and not an ambush, black hair pinned back from a face that had gone perfectly, terribly still. And I put my whole weight into the man's knee and heard it give before I heard myself shout for her to get down. She didn't get down. She turned, calm as a held breath, and shot the third man over my shoulder while I was still elbow deep in disarming the second, and for 1 full second the two of us stood in a room full of dead silence and gun smoke, and simply looked at each other like the ambush had been a formality and this was the actual test. Someone behind her groaned. She didn't glance at him. She looked at me, at the extinguisher still clenched white-knuckled in my fist, and said, "You're hired," in a voice with no more urgency in it than a woman confirming a lunch reservation. I asked her name, mostly to buy my hands time to stop shaking. She said, Marisol Vane, like she was daring the words to mean something to me. And they did. I'd heard the epithet my whole life without a face to put to it. The quiet queen, the woman 3 syndicates were afraid to provoke, and 1 family had apparently just tried anyway. Up close, she smelled like black pepper and rain on hot steel, sharp enough to notice even through the chemical fog my own patches kept me wrapped in, and when she leaned in to check the cut over my eyebrow, her nostrils flared once, almost imperceptibly, like she'd caught the edge of something under the blank I was broadcasting and couldn't place it. "What are you?" she asked, not unkindly, just precisely, the way you'd ask a lock what kind of key it needed. "Whatever you need me to be," I said, which was true in every way she didn't yet understand. And she studied me for 3 full seconds before she said, "Don't lose me." I don't lose people on my watch, and turned to survey the 6 bodies on her floor like they were a spreadsheet error. "Neither do I," I said, and meant it as a promise before I understood I'd just made one. She hired me on the spot, off the books, no registry check, because the woman who'd just saved her from a bullet had also just watched her kill 3 men without blinking, and mutual debts like that tend to buy silence faster than contracts do. I signed nothing. I gave a name and a blood type that was, technically, not a lie. 2 hours later, I was riding an elevator through 30 stories of glass and old money to a penthouse that smelled like her. Black pepper and rain slicked steel soaked into the walls themselves, and thinking that whatever I had just walked into, there would be no clean way to walk back out of it. The Wealth Gap tour started before I'd set my bag down. Marisol's chief of security, a barrel-built man named Tin Calder, who had chewed the same unlit cigarette for as long as I would come to know him, looked at my paperwork, looked at me, and said, 15 years I've run this floor, and I've never seen her hire off a body count, which from him was not a compliment. The other guards on rotation were worse about it in quieter ways. A joke dropped just loud enough to land. A chair pulled out from under me at the mess table before I sat, my coffee replaced twice with someone else's decaf. I ate it. I had eaten worse for less money. What I hadn't expected was the food. 3 nights in, exhausted, skipping dinner to wire half my pay to Mabel's clinic before the transfer window closed, I found a plate outside my door. Nothing fancy, rice, peppers, a kind of stew I hadn't eaten since my mother died, the kind you only know exists if someone asked the right question about where you grew up. Nobody claimed it. When I asked the kitchen staff, they said Miss Vane had requested it, once, without explanation, and told them to keep making it until she said otherwise. I didn't mention it to her. She didn't mention it to me. That was, I would learn, how she loved things before she let herself call it that, sideways, unclaimed, deniable. The charged moment came on the mats. She trained her own detail personally, which no one had warned me about, and on my 5th day, she put me on my back in 4 seconds and then knelt to check my wrist for a break, with a thoroughness that had nothing to do with the injury, and everything to do with the fact that neither of us moved for longer than checking a wrist required. Her thumb ran once over my pulse point. I watched her nostrils flare again, that same small confused hitch like static on a signal she couldn't quite tune. "You smell like nothing," she said, quiet, almost to herself. "Everyone smells like something." "Bad soap," I said, and she let it go, but she filed it. I could see her file it. Ostro found me before she found anything else. Bram Ostro, the Vane organization's underboss for 11 years, cologne like clove and gun oil, a man who addressed every Omega he'd ever met the way you'd address furniture. He cornered me outside the armory on my 9th day and told me, pleasantly, that new hires under his oversight submitted a blood panel within 48 hours, no exceptions. Family policy since the Draventus had tried to plant an infiltrator 2 years back. 48 hours. I did the math on how many patches I had left, how thin the gel was wearing at the seams of the lie, and understood, standing in that hallway, that the countdown Ostro had just started was one I had no way to survive, honestly. I found out 3 days later, at 1:14 in the morning, that I hadn't even needed his deadline. Marisol found the pillbox herself. She'd come to my quarters to hand me the next day's rotation schedule, found the door unlocked because I'd gone to check a noise on the perimeter, and seen the pillbox sitting open on my nightstand where I'd left it after resetting a patch. My mother's initials catching the hallway light, 3 foil-backed suppressant strips lined up inside like evidence, because that is exactly what they were. I came back to find her standing over it, very still, one thumb rubbing slowly over the 3rd knuckle of her left hand, an old scar tick I'd noticed and not yet understood. "How long?" she said. Not a question with room in it for softening, since I was 24. My voice came out steadier than I felt entitled to. The Reach found out. It ended my service. Everyone since has found a reason to fire me the moment it comes up, so I stopped giving them the reason. "You've been standing 3 feet from me for 9 days unregistered." Each word landed flat, controlled, and worse for it. In a house where I have buried 2 men this month. Do you understand what an Omega scent does to a room mid-firefight, Kessler? Do you understand what it does to me? "I understand it better than you do," I said. "I've spent 4 years making sure it never happens." She looked at the pillbox again, and something crossed her face that wasn't fury, not entirely. Something closer to a woman recalculating every gentle thing she'd allowed herself to feel about a person she'd thought was one kind of stranger and had just discovered was another. "Keep it hidden," she finally said. "From everyone. Including me, until I decide what I want to do about this." She closed the pillbox lid herself, set it down with a care that didn't match her voice, and left without another word. I stood in the doorway a long time after, turning that gentleness over in my hands like it might explain itself if I held it long enough. It didn't. Not yet. 3 nights later, the Draventus answered that question for both of us with gunfire. They came in through the service tunnels at 2:47 in the morning, 11 of them, and the first alarm I heard wasn't a siren. It was Tin Calder's voice cracking over the radio saying breach, sub-level 2, and then everything after that happened too fast to be anything but instinct. I was already moving before I registered the patch on my wrist tearing loose in the scramble down the stairwell. Sweat, friction, 48 hours overdue for a change I hadn't had time to make, and by the time I hit the panic room corridor with Marisol's arm looped hard around my ribs, hauling me the last 10 feet through a hail of drywall dust. My real scent had broken loose into the air like something uncaged. Toasted honey. Clean linen. Warm enough that I felt two of the approaching gunmen actually hesitate mid-stride, noses lifting, some old animal circuitry misfiring in the middle of a firefight. Marisol slammed the panic room door, threw the bolt, and put her whole body between me and it before either of us had said a word. For 3 full seconds, neither of us moved. Then she turned, and her face was doing something I hadn't seen it do yet. Not command, not calculation, just raw, unshielded want fighting a war against every rule she'd built her whole life around. "You reek," she said. Low, and it wasn't an insult anymore. I know. My hands were shaking on the doorframe latch. Adrenaline and exposure doing something to my chemistry I hadn't accounted for. "Marisol, I don't care what you are." Her hand came up, not to my wrist, to my jaw. Careful. Testing. "I care that you're standing here and not bleeding out in that hallway." "Tell me to stop," I said, because even with my heart trying to climb out of my chest, some 4-year-old habit made me say it first. "And I will." "Don't," she said, and closed the distance, and the kiss that followed was nothing like the calm, contained woman 3 floors of guards were afraid of. It was hunger held on the shortest leash I'd ever felt a person keep, restraint doing all the work aggression usually did. And when we finally broke apart, she pressed her forehead to mine and said, like it cost her something to admit it, "I don't know what to do with wanting something more than I want to be careful." "Then don't be careful," I said. "Just be honest." Outside, the gunfire slowed, then stopped. Tin's voice crackled through, hoarse, perimeter secured, 6 Traventi men down, 2 of Marisol's own dead. We stayed in that panic room another 40 minutes before it was safe to leave it, and neither of us spent them talking about the dead. The medbay smelled like antiseptic, and underneath it, like both of us, black pepper and rain, honey and linen, tangled together in a way neither the ventilation nor my patches could fully scrub out anymore, and I stopped trying. Marisol sat across from me while the on-call doctor stitched a graze along my forearm, and when the doctor left, she rolled up her own sleeve without being asked and showed me a scar along her ribs, old and pale, 4 inches, precise as a signature. "Alina did this," she said, and I went very still, because the name had never once come up in 9 days, only the absence of it, the way the whole penthouse seemed built around a shape that used to live there. Not on purpose. She was teaching me to fence when we were 23, and I was terrible at it, and she was laughing so hard she forgot to pull the blade. It's the only mark on me that isn't from a fight. She turned her forearm over, tracing the scar with 1 finger. She was my wife. 6 years, 4 months ago, the Draventis put a bomb under her car outside this building, and I have spent every day since deciding that control is the same thing as safety. It isn't. I know that. I've just never had a reason strong enough to stop proving it to myself. I told her about the reach then, the blood panel, the 11 days it took them to force me out without ever saying why. The 4 years since spent proving to strangers that I could be trusted with a rifle if they never found out what I was underneath the patches. I told her about Mabel, the dialysis, the $340,000 I would never earn fast enough, honestly. I showed her the scar on my collarbone from the night I was discharged, when a superior officer who'd once called me the best shot in his company put his hand around my throat instead of a commendation, and she went so quiet I could hear the building's climate system hum. "You've spent 4 years hiding the only part of yourself no one ever thanked you for," she said finally. "Same as you," I said, "hiding the only part of yourself anyone would want." We didn't say the word love that night. We didn't have to. It sat in the room with us, patient, the way honest things do when they know they've already won. And for one evening, we let ourselves cook a meal together in her enormous, underused kitchen. She was, it turned out, catastrophically bad at chopping an onion without narrating a threat assessment of the knife. And I laughed for the first time in longer than I could place, and she looked at me like the sound had rearranged something in her chest. Tin found us there at 11, unlit cigarette forgotten between his fingers, and didn't bother knocking. "Boss," he said, and something in his voice killed the warmth in the room before he finished the sentence. "Ostro's been feeding the Draventis our tunnel schematics for 6 weeks, and there's a photo going around a burner press line. It's Kessler. It's got her patch dosage schedule on it." Marisol's face closed like a door. By morning, the photo had a caption, "Unregistered Omega infiltrator embedded in vein security, 6 weeks and counting." It didn't matter that it was a lie built on a truth. It mattered that Ostro had engineered it to look like I'd been planted, and that Marisol, staring at her tablet with her jaw set in a way I hadn't seen since the panic room, asked me one question in a voice gone as flat and cold as it had been the night she found the pillbox. "Did you know him before this house?" "No, my hands were steady." My voice wasn't. "Marisol, I would never. I need to be sure," she said, and the I in that sentence had never sounded lonelier, and that was the moment my phone buzzed with a photo of my sister Mabel, unconscious on a warehouse floor with a man's boot in frame, and a text with no name attached, "Bring me proof the Queen trusts you, or the girl doesn't wake up." I didn't tell Marisol. That was my mistake, and I knew it even as I made it. I slipped out at 3 a.m. through the service tunnel Ostro's men had used 4 nights earlier, because some cornered animal part of me still believed I could fix this alone, the way I'd fixed everything alone since I was 24. I got as far as the loading dock before Tin's night patrol caught me on camera, badgeless, off-comm, exiting a compromised access point 40 minutes after a leak that had my name on it. They brought me back in cuffs. Marisol met us in the corridor, and for one unbearable second I watched her decide, in real time, which version of me she believed, the one who'd shielded her body in a panic room, or the one every photograph and every camera angle now insisted was a traitor. Her face gave me nothing. "Lock her down," she told Tin, not looking at me again, and walked away, and I understood, watching her go, that I had just handed Ostro exactly the wedge he'd wanted. I had 11 hours in a holding room to make a decision, and I used 4 of them being furious at myself before I used the rest doing what I should have done from the start. I still had my belt buckle, and inside it, sewn into the lining, the recorder I'd carried on every reach mission, out of habit I'd never shaken. I hadn't turned it on that night, but I had it on now, and when the guard assigned to watch me turned out to be one of Ostro's, careless enough to gloat about the warehouse address to a friend on the phone within earshot, I got every word of it. I slid the recorder under the door to Priya, who'd talked her way onto the visitor list on the strength of 9 years of friendship, and one very convincing story about delivering my medication. 40 minutes later, Marisol walked into that holding room herself, recorder in hand, face unreadable in a way that had stopped meaning coldness to me and started meaning she was holding herself together with both hands. "He has your sister," she said, not a question. "Warehouse on Kettner and 9th. I was going to trade myself for her before he hurt you with it. You should have told me the moment it happened." "I know." My voice broke on it. I've spent 4 years being the only person I could trust with my own survival. I forgot how to ask. She unlocked the cuffs herself. "Ask now." The warehouse on Kettner and 9th held Mabel in a back office, 4 of Ostro's men on the floor, and Ostro himself waiting by the loading door like a man who'd already written his own ending. I went in low through the east dock, the way the Reach had trained me to clear a structure I'd never seen, while Marisol and Tin took the front in a wall of gunfire that told every man inside exactly how personally she was taking this. I found Mabel bound but breathing, got her free, and was turning to signal clear when Ostro stepped out of the shadows with a pistol already leveled at the back of my head. Marisol took the round meant for me across the shoulder instead, moving faster than a woman her size training in glass towers had any right to move, and went down hard against a stack of crates, and the sound she made was the only time in 11 days I'd heard her voice hold real pain. I put Ostro on his knees with the butt of his own gun before he'd finished registering that his shot had missed its mark, and stood over him with my finger tight on a trigger and 11 years of every slur, every dismissal, every locked door, screaming at me to finish it. "He killed Elena," Marisol said behind me, pressing a hand to her own shoulder, voice ragged with blood loss and 6 years of grief finally finding a face to aim at. "He's confessed it twice tonight already, to men who are recording every word. Kessler, Wren, don't. Give me one reason. Because if you pull that trigger, you become the thing every registry, every agency, every man who ever called you a liability wanted you to be," she said. "And I have watched you be so much more than that for 2 weeks. Don't let him take that from you, too." I lowered the gun. Ostro, on his knees, laughed the ugly laugh of a man who thought mercy was weakness, right up until Tin cuffed him and read him the full transcript of his own confession back to him, word for word, including the part where he named the Draventi contact who'd paid for Alana's bomb 6 years, 4 months, and 11 days ago. The Vane family council convened 4 days later in a room with more history than furniture, 11 capos and their seconds seated around a table older than most of their organizations, and Marisol stood at its head with her arm in a sling and played them Ostro's confession in full. The tunnel schematics, the kidnapping, the bomb under Elena's car, while I stood at her side in front of the same guards who'd swapped my coffee for decaf 2 weeks earlier, no longer hiding a single thing about what I was. The room went silent in a way that had nothing to do with fear of her and everything to do with the sheer scale of what he'd cost them. Ostro didn't get a trial in the way courts hold them. He got the council's version, faster and more final, and by the time the vote was called, there wasn't a single dissenting hand in the room. Tin found me afterward by the elevator, unlit cigarette finally, actually lit for once. 15 years, he said, and I've never once seen her wait on anyone's account. Not a meeting, not a meal, not a war. You've had her waiting since the day you put a fire extinguisher through a man's collarbone. He didn't say it kindly, exactly, but he said it like a man revising a permanent record. Welcome to the detail, Kessler, for real this time. That night, on the balcony above Harrow Docks, 30 stories over a harbor lit gold with the last of the sun, Marisol knelt, not to propose, not yet, just to be level with me for once instead of always the one standing taller, and said the vow monologue she'd apparently been building since the panic room. I built a life out of being unshakable, because the one time I let myself be soft, I lost her. You have been the first thing in 6 years I have wanted more than I wanted to be careful. I am asking you, with every word I have, to let me be soft again. Only with you. Tell me to stop, I said, one last time, half a joke by now, all the way an offering. Never, she said, and I said the word I'd been circling since the diner alley. Yes, and when her teeth found the curve of my throat that night, gentle, deliberate, asking with her whole body before she asked with her voice, I said it again, out loud, clearly, so there could never be a version of this story where anyone doubted I'd chosen it. A year on, the harbor still turned gold the same way at that hour, and I still noticed. Mabel stood at the edge of it in a dress she'd picked herself. Transplant 6 months healed, color back in her face in a way I'd stopped believing I'd lived to see, laughing at something Priya had said too loudly at the reception behind us. The Vane organization's registry no longer asked the question that had cost me my service and nearly my sister. Marisol had struck the clause herself in the same room where Ostro's confession had played and told the council that any operation too fragile to survive an Omega guarding its door had never deserved its safety in the first place. The wedding had been small, at her insistence and mine both. Vows exchanged on the same balcony, a bond sealed the way it should have been sealed from the start, in daylight, with witnesses who'd once mocked me now standing as guests. On the windowsill of the bedroom we shared now, empty at last, sat a scuffed silver pillbox with 2 initials on the lid that weren't mine, its foil strips gone. Replaced with nothing, because I no longer needed anything in it to be believed. I used to think being seen was the most dangerous thing that could happen to a person like me. I had spent 4 years building a life out of not being noticed, out of scent I could switch off, and a name I could make small enough to slip past every closed door in the city. It turned out the danger was never in being seen. It was in being seen and staying anyway, choosing it again every morning the way she chose it, the way I chose her, in the quiet hour before the harbor woke up and the whole city forgot, for one more day, how close it had come to losing both of us. The end.